The Necromancer's Nephew by Andrew Hunter. Read by Heath Allyn. Chapter 1. Bryn Haven was the most wonderful place in the world to grow up, until the Shadiri burned it to ash. The guardsmen stood the wall singing the old songs, defying the booming chant of the Shadirian war priests massed beyond the river. The townsfolk waited and prayed to 100 different gods in as many tongues. Merchants, artists, dancers, poets, stonecutters, farmers, bakers, all of them free men. They would not kneel. They would not surrender to the dark will of Maliatus, the Shadiri blood god, and his red-armored priests. This was the place where freedom would make its stand. Beyond the walls, the Shadiri chanted their hymns of hate, and their dark spell closed upon the last free city like a red fist. When all the fountains cracked and spilled, the people of Bryn Haven stood and shouted their defiance. When the walls began to bleed, the people stood and called upon the memories of heroes long dead. When the gabled roofs crumbled beneath the first catapult stones, the people stood and cursed the foul god's name. When the yard-long arrows of the Shadiri war machines rained down, and each man saw friend and brother fall slain beside him, the people stood. Then the dragon came, and they could stand no more. Garrett cried when father and mother loaded him onto the handcart and pushed out into the panicked crowd. Why didn't they wait for Graham? Garrett's brother was still at the wall. Father hadn't wanted Graham to join the guard, but he was 16 and old enough to make his own mistakes. It would be 6 more years before Garrett was allowed to do anything fun. Garrett tried to stand up and see what the people were running from. The sky above the rooftops glowed an ugly red. The scent of wood smoke filled the air. Father shoved him down between the stacked loaves of bread that filled the cart. The boy yelped as the hard corner of a coin box jabbed into his elbow. Father and mother were shouting to each other, but Garrett could no longer hear them above the noise of the crowd that pressed ever closer. The cart jostled and bumped. Men cursed and women screamed. Children were crying all around. Garrett had never been so afraid. He huddled in the bottom of the cart and covered his ears with his hands. He didn't want to hear any more. The cart's wheels thumped over the smooth cobblestones, stopping often as people crowded and pushed into the street ahead of them. The air grew hotter, and the crowd more desperate by the moment. The cart overturned when they tried to cross the river south of town. Too many people jammed onto the narrow bridge. The wooden railing strained and splintered, spilling people over the sides into the little river that separated Bryn Haven from the southern farmlands. Garrett fell too. He saw his mother's hand outstretched, but the screaming mass of refugees swept her away as they poured across the last bridge. Falling loaves of bread spun slowly against the angry sky as he fell, and then the cold water hit him. Garrett coughed up river water, spitting and gasping as he surfaced. The bridge seemed so far away now. The river had him, and others like him. Some splashed and tried to scream for help, their mouths filling with water. Garrett remembered what Graham had taught him. Never swim against the current. Swimming perpendicular to the flow of the river, he at last reached the muddy bank, exhausted, near the town wall, a quarter of a mile downriver. The wall jutted out into the river at that point. The dark shadow of a square tower stood with its base submerged in the green water. The brown stones of the wall were very old, stacked high, but roughly, much narrower at the top than at the base. Graham had taught Garrett to climb as well as to swim, and Graham was still somewhere inside those walls. Garrett's hands were rubbed raw by the time he pulled himself over the top of the wall. He rested a moment on the planks of the narrow walkway that ran the length of the curtain wall between the square towers at either end. No guards manned the wall. They must all be away at the north wall to fight the Shadiri. Rising wearily to his feet, Garrett looked to the north and watched Bryn Haven burn. Great columns of smoke rose from the houses and markets of the town, and yellow flames licked at the sooty pall that hung over the city. Dark shapes tumbled from the sky, dragging swirling trails through the haze, catapult stones that landed with muffled booms amid Bryn Haven's ruins. A monstrous shadow passed through the crowd, moving fast towards the west. Garrett thought he glimpsed the sweep of a vast, featherless wing through the smoke. Then came the sound, like a mountain falling down. The roar of the dragon. Garrett's knees gave way beneath him. His breath came fast and shallow, his eyes wide. He watched the air shimmer above the spires of the temple at Westgate. The tile roof glowed a dull red in the invisible heat of the dragon's breath. Stones cracked, walls crumbled, flames danced. The shadow wheeled and swept away, not even pausing to watch as the last sanctum of the Peacebringers fell before the war god's wrath. Garrett mastered his trembling limbs once again as the dragon fear passed. He scrambled down a wooden ladder to the comforting darkness of the streets. The southern end of the town remained untouched by fire. A moment later, he recognized where he was. He had wandered and explored Bryn Haven's every lane and alleyway in his brother's shadow. He could find his way home. Graham would be headed home now, too. Surely the north wall had fallen, and Graham would be looking for his family. They should have waited for him at the bakery so he would know where to find them. At least he would find Garrett there waiting for him when he arrived. Garrett ran faster as ashes fluttered down from the rolling sky, embers singeing his cheeks. He had to get home before Graham got there. Garrett turned up Market Street to find his path blocked by the collapse of the corner theater. Dust swirled above the heap of broken stone and splintered beams of the old playhouse. Garrett's breath caught at the sight of a girl's face looking up at him from the rubble, dead white, with sad, empty eyes. He had to laugh a second later when he realized it was only a mask scattered among the broken marionettes and torn costumes. The hot wind caught at a scrap of red silk and whipped it away beyond the rooftops. The sky rumbled again with the sound of the dragon's wrath. Garrett ran toward the open door of a nearby shop where he had sometimes played with Martin, the cobbler's son. He felt his way through the shadows of the abandoned shop, hoping that he remembered correctly. At the back of the shop, he found a little door opening into a narrow covered alleyway. It ran behind all the shops along that side of Market Street. A dim red glow lit the far end of the alley in the direction of Garrett's home. Heat blasted Garrett's face as he stepped from the alley. For a moment he thought he must be lost. Nothing looked familiar at first. Then he recognized the steaming pool of cracked marble that was the old fountain where he'd sailed many paper boats. The smoldering row of wooden crates along the wall had been brightly painted flower boxes this morning. The blazing skeleton of burning timbers had been his father's bakery, and, above it, poised for one last moment, the blackened frame of the little window of the little room above the stairs. Then the frame folded in on itself, and the only home he had ever known disappeared in a swirl of sparks. Garrett's emotions caught up with him at last, and he fell to his knees beside the broken fountain. Everything and everyone was gone, and there was no one there to tell him what to do. Long he lay there, weeping, his sobs lost amidst the din of crackling fires and crumbling masonry. "Hey, are you all right?" Garrett startled at the sound of the voice, looking up hopefully. Graham? Only it wasn't his brother at all. It wasn't even human. The strange creature that had spoken to him seemed altogether dog-like, covered with dirty gray fur with long, pointed ears and eyes that shined red in the firelight. It stood on its hind legs in a stooped imitation of a man and nearly as tall, but its clawed hands and massive forearms were wrapped around what looked to be a dead body bound tightly in yellowed strips of linen. Garrett felt that he would have been frightened out of his wits except for the comical tilt of the dog thing's head and the non-threatening manner with which it regarded him. "Are you a Shadiri?" Garrett asked. The creature barked a short, manic laugh. "Hardly. I'm trying to get away from those guys." "Well, what are you then?" "I'm a ghoul," the creature said with a grin, its mouth wide and full of sharp teeth. "But don't worry, I only eat dead people. Speaking of which, you want to give me a hand with this?" Garrett eyed the body in the ghoul's arms. "What's that?" "Sabayal Maktul," the ghoul answered proudly. "The first lord of Bryn Haven. He's always been a little too well guarded to get at. Well, until today, that is. But he's mine now." "And you're going to eat him?" Garrett asked, feeling a little sick. "Oh, no," the ghoul said. "Not that I haven't thought about it, but once they get this old, the taste of them's gone off. And anyway, these things are worth an awful lot of fresh meat to those who know how to use them. I'll cut you in on the profits if you help me get him back to the burrow." Garrett rose a bit shakily and moved toward the ghoul and his grim burden. Not much of what the creature had said made any sense, but he had to do something. The boy stooped and lifted the linen-wrapped ankles of the dead lord of Bryn Haven, grunting at the weight. "Heavy, yeah?" The ghoul grinned. "They used to sew a bag of gold inside him before they planted him. Weird custom, right? Well, gold's useful too where we're going." "Where are we going?" Garrett asked as they struggled down the broad lanes, swinging wide to avoid a collapsed roof that had fallen across the way. "Oh," the ghoul said, "I just need you to help me get this guy to the boneyard. After that, me and my kind are clearing out for Merowyn. We can bust him open, and I'll give you some of the gold when we get to the yard, if you like." "Oh, thanks," Garrett answered, not really knowing what else to say. "What's your name, anyway?" "Garrett." "Thanks for your help, Garrett. Most humans wouldn't, you know." "Yeah." "My name's Warren, by the way," the ghoul said, looking down to mind his shaggy feet as he backed over a pile of old clothes. As Garrett started to speak again, the ground shook with a tremendous boom. Buildings on either side of the lane in front of them collapsed as the dragon landed in the street ahead. Warren's head seemed to turn toward the sound with impossible slowness, and Garrett's eyes locked on the enormous beast. The dragon's eyes flared with golden heat, its scales the color of stained silver, its black jaws opened like the door of an oven. The air shimmered. Garrett threw his body full against the startled ghoul, toppling him backwards off the rag heap even as the dragon's breath washed over them. The shock of superheated air hurled their bodies through the thin lattice frontispiece of a flower shop. Garrett slammed hard against the counting table, breaking wood and bone. The pain of the heat seared his flesh, unthinkable, unbearable. Then there was only a dull throb of things broken and burnt and a sound like pebbles rattling down a clay drainpipe. The dragon's rasping breath. Garrett looked up through puffy, swollen eyelids toward the shop's entryway. The black-scaled head of the dragon moved past the shattered doorway, not bothering to look inside. Garrett watched as the beast passed by. Across the dragon's back, astride an ornately carved saddle, sat a huge man, clad in red armor. The rider's horned helm swung toward the shop as he passed. From the shadow of his visor, two cold blue eyes fell upon the boy, and Garrett's labored breath faltered. Then the man was gone, and the black tail of the Shadiri dragon coiled and lashed away the storefront, bringing the roof down atop the boy. Voices. Garrett woke to the sound of voices and a terrible coldness in his body. "What in the hell are you thinking, boy?" spoke a rough, unfamiliar voice. "I had him, Dad. I had him in my arms. Makdul himself." "Where is he now?" spoke a third voice, cool and dispassionate. "Cremated," Warren answered. "You almost were too, you idiot." Garrett tried to move, shooting pain. He moaned. "What's that?" Sounds of breaking wood, more pain. A dim light, the glow of dying fires. "Hey," Warren exclaimed, "he's still alive!" "Just a boy." The calm voice belonged to a tall figure in a dark purple robe. The robe's hood concealed his face, but the man's gnarled hands, clutching an iron skull-topped staff, seemed human. "Looks like he got the worst of it." The rough voice was that of a massive, patchy-haired ghoul who casually tossed aside the wreckage of the shop's roof as though it weighed nothing. "His name's Garrett," Warren said, kneeling beside him. "He was helping me." "Leave him be, boy," the old ghoul said, shaking his head. "He's done." "You saved my life, Dad." "He's not one of us," the old ghoul barked. "We don't have time." As Warren and his father argued, the robed man knelt beside Garrett, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his hood.
"Tenzin,"
the old ghoul called.
"will you talk some sense into the boy? The Sideri will be here sooner than later."
Garrett tried to speak, but only a faint wheezing sound came out. The hooded man looked down at him in silence. At last he pulled back his hood to reveal the gaunt features of an old man, his face lined by years of sorrow and horror, his hair thin and pale. Yet in his eyes burned still a warmth and humor undiminished by time.
"Vargas," the man said, "it is not our birth that makes us who we are, but the choices we make. This boy has cast his lot with the keepers of the dead. He comes with us."
Chapter 2. The streets of Whither twisted like a fine network of veins between the high granite walls of the ancient city. The lifeblood of commerce pumped through its narrow lanes and alleys, bringing riches and refugees from the farthest reaches of the realm. Whither, tomb city of sorcerer kings, belonged to the priestesses of Maravant. The sisterhood of the dead goddess ruled the grey city with ruthless efficiency and suffered no troublemakers, creating a haven of cruel safety against the chaos of the war-ravaged world outside its walls. Never was the sun seen in Whither. The city lay in the hollow between the mountains and the sea at the northwestern corner of God's cursed Glore. Even at midday, with the sun high above the jagged peaks of the eastern range, no bright beam could penetrate the grey cloak of perpetual haze in which slumbering Mount Padres wrapped itself. Though it might trouble a human like Garrett, who had not seen the sun at all in the 3 years since his arrival, in Whither there were other folk whom this grim and eternal gloom suited quite well. Business thrived in the shadows for troll trappers, naga apothecaries, and horned satyrs who looked up from their ebony carvings with glowing eyes to watch the human boy pass. Garrett pulled his hood a bit lower and walked a little faster. He did not fear these creatures now as much as he once had, but rather the coming of night, and with it the city curfew. Those who wished to see another dawn did not linger in the streets of Whither after eventide. Garrett turned down a short alleyway lined with gloomy little shops, their windows filled with loathsome curios and frightful reagents, useful for only the darkest of magic. He paused at the door of the inmost shop. Its broad window glowed with the golden warmth of 100 luminous creatures. Fairies and their kin, captured in the wild southern forests, were bound with magic inside tiny silver cages. Such bright and beautiful pets demanded a high price in the Twilight City and brought great wealth to those who could catch them. Very few creatures could catch a fairy, and one of these was a vampire. Garrett cleared his throat and brushed the wrinkles from his purple robe. His gloved hand trembled a little on the handle of the door, as it always did. The boy marshaled his courage and opened the door. The tinkling doorbells drew the attention of the girl inside the shop. She turned and greeted him with a smile brighter than any fairy's wing, the vampire girl, slender and tall, pale and perfect. She dropped with silent grace from a ladder that rolled upon a track the length of the shelf-lined back wall. Her long, dark hair framed her sad, sweet eyes, spilling down to the shoulders of her gray linen coveralls. "Hi, Garrett," she said. "Hi, Marla," Garrett smiled, immensely pleased that his voice had not cracked this time. "Your uncle's package arrived this morning," she said. "We've got it in the back." She swung open the waist-high gate that led behind the shop's counter and motioned for Garrett to follow her. He did so without hesitation. Marla's long fingers drew back a heavy curtain painted with swirling runes, and Garrett stepped through. His shoulder brushed against hers as he moved past. "Good evening, Garrett," Marla's mother greeted him as he entered the back room of the pet store. "Good evening, Mrs. Veranu," Garrett said. "How is your uncle these days?" she asked, pulling a largish paper-wrapped bundle down from a shelf. As with most vampires that Garrett had met, he could hazard no guess at her age. Taller than Marla, but of a similar slim build, she looked no older than a woman in her mid-20s. Her short, sandy brown hair added to her youthful appearance. Her amber eyes flashed with an impish gleam, undimmed by her ghostly complexion. Nevertheless, her lips remained hidden behind a red silk scarf coiled around her neck, a colorful accessory that contrasted sharply with her somber gray clothing in the style favored by the vampires of the city. "Uncle's doing well," Garrett said. "I think he's really excited about this package, whatever's in it. Do you know what it is?" "Of course I know what it is, you goose," Mrs. Vranu laughed. "I had to find the beastly thing, and it wasn't easy. Still, if you want to know, you'd better ask him, though I can't imagine what's so secret about it." She let the heavy package drop on a stained workbench. "Oh," Garrett said, "I also needed to get a flask of essence while I'm here, if I could." "Certainly," Mrs. Vranu said. "Marla will help you with that. I need to finish a bit of inventory before we close for the night." "Thank you," Garrett said, pulling a glass and steel canister from his shoulder bag. As soon as the canister was clear of the bag, it disappeared from his grasp. Startled, he turned to find Marla holding it, smiling at him from across the room. He shook his head. Her ability to move with inhuman speed in complete silence still unnerved him each time she played these little tricks on him. And each time, it seemed, she got a little bit faster. "This won't take a minute," she said. Marla opened the canister's valve and fitted it into the base of a large mechanical grinder. "Is Elkhorn all right?" "Yeah," Garrett said. "We don't need anything fancy. Uncle's just got a few reses for a contract this week." Marla nodded and began to lift large scoopfuls of wriggling horned beetles from a barrel and drop them into the grinder's hopper. Garrett winced at the awful crunching sound as the vampire girl spun the wheel of the machine, and a lambent green ooze began to fill his canister. She slowed the wheel as the glass window on the canister showed it nearly full. She lifted the flask from the machine's base and wiped a drop of the glowing essence from the nozzle before closing the seal on the container. Garrett had to grin when she licked her finger. Disgusting or not, he still thought it was cute. "Do you have a few minutes?" Marla asked. Garrett had as many as she wanted. Yeah. "Mom, can I show him the baby?" Marla asked. "Isn't it almost curfew?" Mrs. Vranu asked without looking up from her tablet. I have a little time before I have to be back," Garrett said. "All right then, just don't keep him too late, Marla." Marla grinned, setting aside the filled canister and waving Garrett over to a largish cage in the corner, a cage covered with a tattered blanket. "Be very quiet," she whispered. "He's still asleep." Garrett knelt on the floor beside Marla, his arm pleasantly tingling where she leaned against him. Her hair smelled like the memory of flowers. She lifted the edge of the blanket, and Garrett marveled at what he saw. Inside the cage, upon a little mound of hay, lay a small bat-like creature, no larger than a kitten. At first he wondered if it might be dead, but then he saw its tiny chest move as it breathed in its sleep. It had no eyes, only a featureless black carapace above its broad mouth. Indeed, the whole thing seemed to be covered in leathery black plates, with only a wispy gray mane along the back of its neck, surmounted by two tiny curved horns atop its head. In addition to membranous wings, it possessed as well miniature sets of arms and legs, ending in three clawed talons that stretched and flexed as the creature dreamed. It gave a sort of mewing yelp and nestled deeper into its bed of hay. "What is it?" Garrett asked. "It's a baby Gaunt," Marla said, her eyes glittering. "Can you believe it?" "A Gaunt?" "Yes," she said. "The Moonwings have come to the city, and they've brought a covey of Gaunts with them." "Moonwings?" Garrett asked. Sometimes Marla thought that everyone else knew as much as she did about everything. "The Moonwings are vampires who ride fully grown Gaunts like the ones that gave birth to this little one. They're here now and staying with us at the embassy." "Ride them? How big do they get?" Garrett asked. "Big enough," Marla laughed. "Oh, Garrett, they're beautiful. I wish I could ride one." "But why are they here in the city?" "I don't know," Marla said. "It must be something." Mrs. Vranu cleared her throat loudly, interrupting her. Marla looked as though she were about to speak again when a new sound broke the silence. The first mournful sounds of the even chimes rang out through the city, signaling the end of the day and the impending onset of curfew. The sounds sent a thrill of fear through Garrett's chest. You'd better go, Marla said. Yeah. Mrs. Verano helped bind Uncle's package to the side of Garrett's shoulder bag since it was too bulky to fit inside. She hustled him toward the door with the admonishment to run all the way home. He paused at the door, risking another moment to say goodbye to Marla. Curfew be damned, he loved seeing her smile. Go! Marla's mother gave Garrett a gentle shove out the door. The last worried shoppers of the evening hurried to clear the street. Again, the temple bells rang out. Only 3 more until curfew. Garrett ran. The purple robes and knee-high boots favored by the Brotherhood of Necromancers, while striking in appearance, at least when worn by the fully grown members of the order, proved ill-suited for Garrett's undignified sprint. Fortunately, only a handful of people remained on the street to bear witness as the boy clopped loudly down the darkened lane. Uncle's package proved ungainly as well. The weight of it pulled him off balance with every step, and the wrapper had begun to tear as the twine binding sank into the soft bulk underneath the paper. Garrett dared a glance down to secure the load and noticed the tear. Through it, he caught a glimpse of curly hair, so white that it seemed to sparkle in the dim light. His skin crawled to think what might be inside the package. Rare were the days when Uncle did not ask Garrett to transport some manner of dead thing either here or there, but the contents of those grisly parcels were seldom a secret. The 3rd chime rang out. He would never make it home in time. Garrett's feet ached, and the strap of his satchel rubbed his shoulder raw, even through the heavy wool of his robe. His pulse pounded in his ears, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The 4th bell rang. Garrett looked around frantically. A thin fog crept from black alleyways into the empty streets. The sound of a bolt being thrown shut echoed through the silent lane, and the witchfire street lamps hissed and sputtered, then flickered out. The starless shadow of night engulfed him. Garrett stumbled to a halt at an intersection of 3 streets. One of them led home, but doubts filled the darkness. It had to be that way. Garrett ran again, almost immediately catching the toe of his boot on an uneven cobble. He fell hard, landing on the package. Soft and thick, the mysterious parcel broke his fall, but the canister inside his bag bounced free and skittered across the pavement. Garrett scrambled on his hands and knees to retrieve it, grateful for the canister's firefly glow. His fingers closed around the cool metal, stopping its roll. Cold tendrils of fog passed over his hand, and Garrett felt a sensation like ants crawling up the back of his neck. Dark magic. The last bell rang. Garrett froze. His eyes strained against the darkness, seeing nothing beyond the ghostly circle of green light cast by the essence flask. Nothing happened. He laughed, barely, almost a squeak. Perhaps the night watch was only a story after all. A low, grating sound, metal on stone, echoed through the hollow streets. Garrett dared not move. Then came a sound made of nightmares. A hoarse, wordless moan that did not echo at all. The very air seemed to fall silent and dead at the sound, and Garrett's lungs heaved to draw breath that would not come. Garrett got to his feet, gathering up the canister and Uncle's package. The package had torn open in the fall, and he quickly bundled it back into place. The parcel contained a heavy fleece of shimmering white wool. It radiated strange warmth, and when he touched it, a measure of his fear withered in its unnatural heat. The evil cry sounded again, but this time Garrett did not shrink from it. He tucked the bundle under his arm and hurried down the street that would lead him home, careful this time of his steps. The cry sounded once more, closer this time. Then a sound like dead tree branches dragged across stones, repeating rhythmically. Garrett stopped. The sound came from ahead. The boy took a cautious step backwards, afraid to make a noise. The scraping sound grew louder. Garrett's eyes focused on the dim gap between the dark silhouettes of rooftops ahead. Then something moved into the gap, a black shadow against the gray night sky. Taller than any man, misshapen and skeletal, the watcher turned to face him. 2 faint embers of blue flame throbbed in the shadow of its horned head. It saw him. The Watcher screamed. Garrett's blood went cold, and he ran. He raced back down the street toward the intersection with no other plan than to get away. Another hoarse cry answered from nearby, and then another. Garrett whimpered and gasped, stumbling into the center of the crossroads once again. A second monstrous figure lurched against the skyline of the market district, and another approached from the west. Garrett spun, uncertain which way to run, and the essence flask slipped from his grasp. The green glowing canister bounced and rolled across the flagstones, coming to rest for a moment in the gutter. It tipped on its end and disappeared into darkness with a sullen clunk. Garrett's eyes went wide, and he rushed to the place where it had disappeared. A drain pipe. Garrett squeezed his body through the narrow opening, dragging the fleece in after him. He dropped several feet to the trash-strewn floor of the tunnel beneath the street, finding his flask half buried in the muck. Above him, the Watchers cried out in unison, a howl of utter despair, which made Garrett clutch the warm fleece to his chest and try in vain to shut out the horrible sound. A single bony claw raked and scrabbled at the mouth of the pipe, and Garrett wasted no time in collecting his things and fleeing further down the tunnel. Holding the canister in front of him, Garrett used its eerie light to guide his steps deeper into the sewer. Ancient tunnels like this one honeycombed the hills beneath the city. They weren't exactly safe, but still better than the alternative above. The tunnel curved downward until he reached a junction, and he paused, trying to guess which one would lead him to Uncle's house. Neither way looked particularly promising, but he had to choose one, and he did. Soon he found himself sloshing through foul, ankle-deep water. Fortunately, this was one thing for which Necromancer footwear was designed. The treated leather boots kept his aching feet dry at least, though they often slipped and skidded in the slime beneath the roiling surface of the dark water. He paused after a particularly dangerous slide, catching himself against a rough stone wall. Listening, he heard again what he thought he had heard before. A faint splash came from the tunnel behind. Garrett spun, raising his glowing flask high. A black circle of the unknown stared back at him from beyond the range of his dim lamp. "Who's there?" Garrett's voice shook a little. A low growl answered from the darkness, and two baleful red eyes moved against the shadow. "Stay back!" Garrett cried. His foot slipped again, leaving him poised off-center against the wall. The thing in the darkness crouched and then leapt. A hairy shape full of teeth and claws burst from the blackness, and Garrett fell backwards with a startled cry. Clawed hands caught the front of Garrett's robe, snatching him up before he touched the floor. Wheezy, snickering laughter and hot breath that smelled like old wet rot washed over him as he was pulled to his feet. "That's not funny, Warren," Garrett yelled, but he could not help laughing too. Warren the Ghoul patted the boy's shoulder and grinned his toothy grin. "I got you good, didn't I?" Garrett frowned. "You want to help me get home?" "Yeah," Warren said. "You were going the right way. You just got to take a side tunnel up here at the pit." "Oh, yeah, I thought this pipe looked familiar." They soon emerged into a large subterranean roundhouse that formed a hub for a dozen tunnels, all draining into the pit at the center. Garrett and Warren had spent many hours at the pit, tossing various objects into the yawning vertical shaft. They had never once heard anything hit bottom. Even in the faint glow of Garrett's flask, the sight of it comforted him with its familiarity. "Almost there," Garrett sighed. "You want to come over for dinner?" "Nah," Warren said. "I was just here. Your uncle sent me out to find you." "What were you doing at the house?" Garrett asked. Warren looked away, clearing his throat. "Nothing, just some errands for your uncle." Garrett narrowed his eyes. "Did he say anything about what this fleece was for?" he asked, indicating the torn package at his side. "Oh, you got it," Warren said. "Where'd you find it?" "Mrs. Veranu's shop." "Ah," Warren bared his long teeth in a canine grin. "That's why you were out past curfew." Did Uncle say what this was for or not?" Warren wrinkled his nose. "Look, Garrett, I've got to get home or my dad's going to kill me. We're going into the catacombs tonight." The catacombs, Garrett groaned. You guys always go without me.
Sorry, Garrett, family trip,
Warren said.
My cousin's in town. He's a real knob anyway. I'll be back in a couple of days. I'll bring you something if we find anything.
You better, Garrett said. Anyway, have fun. Warren smiled at his friend's sulky look.
You too,
the ghoul said, turning to lope away into the darkness. Yeah, lots of fun here, Garrett muttered as he started up the tunnel that led to Uncle Tinjin's house.